And so from phase 1 and 2 comes SRFSI's third phase, crudely known as the scaling phase. And the point of this phase is to really build upon what was done and all the successes in phase 1 and phase 2 of SRFSI, and to make sure that there is longevity and sustained impact from all of the work that SRFSI has done. SRFSI's final phase went for 27 months. However, 19 of those months were under COVID restrictions, making working on scaling very difficult. All of our activities were within our overarching question: what worked where and why? And what does that mean for future scaling efforts? This was framed all within ensuring a clear exit strategy, something that many projects don't think about until it's too late. I know that this was a tough adjustment for many partners when we started saying that we weren't going to directly fund farmer demonstrations and that we needed to move towards co-funding and co-ownership of these activities for sustainability. However, I think that that was important in creating our narrative of scaling sustainability. In full, we had two aims. The first was to build a functional understanding of how to enact autonomous CASI scaling post-SRFSI project closure. That is, the what of scaling. How do we scale CASI? And secondly, to catalyze requirements that facilitate widespread autonomous adoption of CASI post-SRFSI closure. That is, what do we need to do and how do we then action it? We also made efforts to integrate regionally the project after context-specific efforts were focused in phase 2. Of course, all of this was made much harder because 70% of this phase was under COVID restrictions. To achieve this, we wanted to cross off against two key objectives. Firstly, we wanted to truth and confirm CASI as valid in the EGP, and particularly with non-SRFSI farmers and non-SRFSI communities. We also wanted to explore the decision-making of various sub-typologies to understand how this set of technologies was integrating into communities. Secondly, we had to cement SRFSI's legacy through a focus on creation, accessibility, and integration. In terms of our research activities, there were two key SRFSI surveys. The first one was the SRFSI Regional Impact Evaluation Survey, covering more than 5,000 households. The second was the SRFSI Qualitative Decision-Making Survey, which covered 336 individuals and went into great depth on their decision-making across various typologies of CASI users. We also had several targeted collaborations, including a Reason Gender photo voice survey, a collaboration with USAID CIMMYT Nepal on an all of Nepal mechanization survey, a collaboration with Bill and Melinda Gates CIMMYT in Bihar on direct seeded rice assessments for service provision. We also collaborated with ASIA and the Australian National University on a digital agri-advisory study in Bihar, and we completed our innovation platforms assessment. All of this was done with a focus on trying novel analytical approaches to create the most in-depth understanding of the situation, and at points also looking at indirect outcomes of certain decision-making outcomes. Now, speaking of novel frameworks, anyone who's talked to me for more than 30 seconds will have heard my ranting and raving about how we tend to talk about adoption, and particularly about adoption as a binary outcome. In this phase of SRFSI, we really wanted to extend our analytics around understanding not just adoption, but around adoption processes, typologies, and moving beyond adoption and non-adoption. We further adapted some existing frameworks that have been used to assess conservation agriculture adoption in Africa. And as you'll see in later sessions, this can really add more nuanced understanding as to where we are now, how we got here, and what it means for future scaling efforts. Some example outputs like this highlight just what is the status how we got there, and where we go from here. Another focus that we had in this phase of SRFSI was around creating a more nuanced understanding of farmer decision making, and particularly through understanding the multiple levels that individuals assess and make their resource allocation decisions. In this framework, titled the Decision Making Dartboard, we look at 4 different resource types across 6 different levels. Like our first key framework, this is also adapted from work done to understand conservation agriculture decision making in Eastern and Southern Africa. We applied this across multiple typologies to unpack how someone ends up at a certain technology and what are the next steps to progress them along in the adoption process. When we do that, we get these mind maps that link often unknown or thought of as unrelated elements in the decision-making process and helps us look at what are the next steps in increasing community-level adoption. Of course, SRFSI is not just a research project, so our other objective was to ensure that all our great work was meaningfully used and accessed once the project ends. This covered many topics and activities, but the highlights include development of new materials, increasing accessibility to our created knowledge, developing new tools, creating and assisting with key infrastructure, and ensuring that we can articulate what happens next once SRFSI finishes. I'm sure you'll be able to make your own conclusions around the importance and success of this third phase of SRFSI, but let me try and push you in the right direction. This phase was really important because it confirmed CASI as valid across the region for smallholder farmers. It also established the current status and what that means for future scaling efforts. We were able to close some of the scaling gaps with our legacy activities. And we continued to build momentum with sustainability in mind despite COVID-19. Most importantly, we were able to establish what next steps are needed for sustained autonomous adoption of CASI across the region.